The collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s did not just mark the end of a country, it ignited a chain reaction that reshaped an entire region. As long-standing political tensions cracked open, old identities resurfaced with explosive force. In the middle of this storm stood Slobodan Milosevic, a leader who rose to prominence by tapping into nationalist sentiment and framing himself as the defender of Serbian unity. His ambition for what many called a Greater Serbia set off a wave of unrest that quickly spread across Bosnia, Croatia, and Kosovo, pulling millions of ordinary people into the heart of a conflict they never asked for. This was not a distant political struggle. It was a transformation that reached directly into families, neighborhoods, and generations. Some fought to preserve a country they believed in. Others struggled simply to survive as lines were drawn, redrawn, and then erased again. From the ruins of cities to the silent roads of mass displacement. The story of Yugoslavia's breakup is not just about geopolitics, it is about human lives caught between forces far larger than themselves. As we begin this journey into one of the most turbulent chapters of modern European history, your support truly helps this channel bring more well-researched, meaningful stories to life. If you find value in deep, thoughtful explorations like this one, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It is a simple action that lets us keep creating content that matters and ensures you never miss the next chapter in our historical investigations. Let us dive into the origins of a conflict that reshaped the Balkans and left a legacy the world still feels today. As the political ground beneath Yugoslavia crumbled, the rising tide of nationalism did far more than reshape borders. It reshaped the instincts, fears, and calculations of those who rose to power. Among them were Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, two figures whose influence over the Bosnian Serb forces would alter the fate of entire communities. What began as a struggle for political control evolved into a sweeping campaign to redraw the ethnic landscape of Bosnia. Town after town found itself pulled into a strategy that combined territorial ambition with the deliberate removal of those seen as obstacles to that vision. Families who had lived side by side for generations suddenly found themselves marked by the identities politics had thrust upon them, and the tensions that had once been abstract became painfully real. The terrain of eastern Bosnia became the stage for a sequence of events that steadily escalated, each step stripping away another layer of normalcy. Villages that had once echoed with everyday life became empty overnight, not through natural migration or gradual change, but through a coordinated effort to push entire populations away from their homes. As these operations unfolded, uncertainty consumed the people who remained. Many hoped the upheaval would pass, that reason would prevail, that international authorities would step in before the situation spun further out of control. Yet each passing month showed that the trajectory was moving in only one direction towards something far more devastating than displacement. Srebrenica, a small town designated as a protected area by the international community, became a symbol of fragile hope. Tens of thousands of people fled there, believing that the United Nations' presence would shield them from the intensifying turmoil. For a time, the blue-helmeted soldiers stationed in the enclave offered a sense of reassurance, a belief that the worst could be averted. But the reality was more complicated than the promise. The forces assigned to protect the enclave were limited, unable to match the strength and coordination arrayed around the region. As pressure mounted, the gap between expectation and capacity grew dangerously wide. When Bosnian Serb forces advanced toward the enclave in the summer of 1995, the people inside faced a moment that would come to define not only the conflict, but the world's understanding of how vulnerable civilians can be when political will falters. The fall of Srebrenica was not a sudden collapse, but the culmination of months of encirclement, warnings, and appeals that never translated into meaningful action. Residents watched the horizon, hoping for intervention, yet the silence remained unbroken. The advance into the town unfolded with an inevitability that left little room for escape. Men and boys attempted to flee through the surrounding forests, clinging to any chance of survival, while women, children, and the elderly gathered in desperation near positions, believing that proximity to peacekeepers might offer some form of safety. What followed became one of the darkest chapters in Europe's post-war history. Over the course of several days, more than 8,000 men and boys were taken from their families and never returned. The absence they left behind was not only personal but communal, reshaping towns, villages, and generations to come. Families spent years searching for answers, holding on to hope long after the world had turned its attention elsewhere. The loss was so vast, so concentrated, that it carved itself into the collective memory of the region. Even today, the story of Srebrenica stands as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked extremism, the fragility of international promises, and the human cost of political ambition. Yet the events surrounding Srebrenica were not isolated. They were deeply entwined with the broader unraveling of Yugoslavia, with the ambitions of leaders, the failures of institutions, and the fears that spread through communities caught between forces they could not control. The tragedy did not emerge from a vacuum, but from a series of decisions, warnings ignored, and opportunities lost. In understanding how it happened, the larger story of the conflict becomes clearer, a story in which every event connects to the one before it, shaping a path whose consequences still echo across the Balkans today. When the world first heard the phrase safe area, many believed it marked a turning point, a promise that, even in the chaos of the Balkans, there would be pockets where civilians could breathe freely and where fear would loosen its grip. However briefly, yet as the conflict deepened and tensions sharpened, the idea of protection began to drift further from reality. The designations were clear on paper, but on the ground they became fragile islands surrounded by shifting alliances, rising hostility, and a rapidly changing military landscape. After the tragedy that unfolded in Srebrenica, that fragility would become impossible to ignore. In the months leading up to those events, people inside these enclaves clung to the hope that the international community's presence would serve as a barrier against looming danger. United Nations peacekeepers arrived with bright blue helmets and an air of authority, but they were sent without the resources, manpower, or mandate required to confront the escalating threat. Their vehicles carried flags meant to symbolize neutrality and protection, yet their orders restricted them from engaging in the very confrontations that civilians feared most. Over time, the gap between expectation and reality widened, until it became a chasm that no diplomatic reassurance could fill. As the conflict intensified, the enclaves grew more crowded, swelling with families who had walked for days to reach what they believed was sanctuary. Their lives were packed into abandoned factories, schools, and makeshift shelters where children learned to distinguish the distant echo of artillery from the sound of trucks bringing supplies. Every day they asked the same question, whether the promise of safety still held meaning outside the fences. The landscape changed quickly as Bosnian Serb forces advanced and surrounding towns emptied under pressure. The peacekeepers who remained inside the enclaves reported the shifting situation, but the warnings that filtered upward confronted political hesitation, logistical delays, and competing priorities among international powers. By the time the encirclement tightened, the peacekeepers had become painfully aware of how limited their presence truly was. They held negotiations, issued requests, and attempted to create corridors for aid. But their influence depended on the cooperation of armed groups whose goals were far removed from humanitarian concerns. Moments that could have altered the course of events slipped away, because those with the authority to intervene lacked either the will or the consensus to do so decisively. In the final days, the blue helmets became emblematic not of protection, but of constraint, symbols of a global system that sought stability yet hesitated at the edge of responsibility. When the enclave finally collapsed, the world witnessed in stark clarity how fragile promises can be when not reinforced by action. The safe areas had been envisioned as shields, but without the support needed to uphold them, they became reminders of what happens when intentions fail to match reality. The tragedy that followed reshaped international policy, compelled difficult debates about intervention, and left families who had placed their faith in the system grappling with the consequences of its shortcomings. In the aftermath, survivors would speak of those days with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow, carrying forward a painful lesson about the cost of relying on protections that exist more in theory than in practice. As the conflict ground on and the consequences of failed international protections became impossible to ignore, another front in the wider struggle for dominance unfolded farther west, where Croatia was preparing a move that would shift the balance of power across the entire region. For years, vast portions of Croatian territory had remained under the control of Serb forces, forming a patchwork of enclaves that stood as both a political obstacle and a symbol of the fractured landscape left behind by Yugoslavia's collapse. Diplomacy had brought little change, and ceasefires repeatedly dissolved before the ink dried, leaving communities suspended between uncertainty and the quiet determination to reclaim what had once been theirs. Against this backdrop, Croatia began planning an operation that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict and send ripples far beyond its borders. The months leading to the offensive were marked by a mix of calculated preparation and rising anticipation. Croatian leaders, aware of the shifting international climate following the tragedies in Bosnia, recognized that the world's patience with stalemate and stagnation was wearing thin. As reports of the humanitarian crisis mounted and pressure increased for a decisive path forward, Croatia sought strategic guidance and support from allied nations eager to stabilize the region. The result was a plan shaped by both military precision and the broader desire to redefine political boundaries that had remained contested since the war's earliest days. To many within Croatia, the operation represented not merely a military objective, but the opportunity to reclaim a sense of national coherence after years of fragmentation. When the offensive finally began, it unfolded with a speed and coordination that surprised even those who had monitored the buildup. Columns of Croatian units advanced across terrain that had long been synonymous with checkpoints and stalled negotiations, moving in a way that signaled the determination to end a stalemate that had overshadowed the lives of thousands. Families who had lived under divided rule watched the rapid developments with a mixture of hope and apprehension, uncertain of how the sudden shift would reshape their future. At the same time, Serb communities, many of whom had been rooted in those regions for generations, found themselves caught in the accelerating movement of forces. Unsure of where safety lay as front lines dissolved and new realities emerged. As the operation pressed forward, it became clear that this was not simply another maneuver in a protracted conflict, but a watershed moment. Territories that had remained contested for years were reclaimed in a matter of days. And with each advance, Croatia further consolidated its position within the regional power dynamics. Yet the success of the operation carried with it a profound human cost. As large numbers of Serb civilians left their homes in haste, compelled by fear, uncertainty, and the shifting political landscape, roads once used for daily travel became crowded with vehicles loaded with personal belongings, memories, and the remnants of interrupted lives, forming a long procession that underscored the human dimension of geopolitical transformation. In the aftermath, the operation's significance became undeniable. It marked the erosion of Serbian dominance that had characterized much of the conflict and signaled a turning point that would influence negotiations and diplomatic strategies in the years to follow. International observers viewed the outcome as evidence of how rapidly the balance could change when a nation combined organization, external backing, and a resolute vision of its future. For those who lived through it, however, the memories were more complex, shaped not only by the reclaiming of territory, but by the dislocation, uncertainty, and emotional weight borne by those who were uprooted along the way. The event became a chapter in the larger story of a region struggling to redefine itself amid shifting borders, lingering tensions, and the ongoing search for lasting stability. As the regional landscape continued to shift after Croatia's decisive advance, attention returned to Bosnia, where the long-suffering city of Sarajevo remained trapped under one of the most enduring and painful sieges of the conflict. For years, its residents had lived with the sound of distant shelling, becoming an everyday backdrop, each echo weaving itself into the rhythm of life in a city that refused to surrender its identity despite the relentless pressure surrounding it. The world had watched the situation unfold with growing urgency, yet concrete action had remained elusive, constrained by political divisions, cautious mandates, and the hope that negotiations alone might eventually break the deadlock. But as renewed Serbian attacks intensified and the toll on civilians grew impossible to ignore, the international community faced a reckoning it could no longer postpone. What followed would represent a dramatic shift in both strategy and resolve. In the late summer months, the escalation around Sarajevo sent a clear message that previous attempts to stabilize the region through diplomacy had reached their limits. Reports emerging from the city described neighborhoods once alive with families now struggling under persistent strikes that cut off essential supplies and deepened the humanitarian crisis. International observers, who had grown accustomed to documenting the ebb and flow of violence, found themselves recording scenes that demonstrated how fragile the balance had become. Across global capitals, debates intensified as leaders weighed the consequences of continued restraint against the rising cost of inaction. The tragedies that had unfolded elsewhere in Bosnia lingered in the collective memory, adding pressure to avoid another failure that would echo through history. When NATO finally launched Operation Deliberate Force, it did so with a clarity of purpose shaped by months of rising tension and a growing recognition that the conflict needed a decisive external push toward resolution. The operation targeted key military positions surrounding Sarajevo, striking at the infrastructure that had sustained the siege and signaling a new willingness to confront the forces that had kept the city isolated for so long. Residents inside Sarajevo, who had endured years of uncertainty, listened as the sounds around them changed. For the first time in a long while, the noise echoing through the valley reflected not suppression but a potential turning point. The shift brought a cautious sense of relief, tempered by the knowledge that the path ahead remained uncertain, yet unmistakably altered. As the operation continued, its impact became evident across political and military landscapes alike. Serbian units began to withdraw from critical positions, not through gradual negotiation but as a direct response to the pressure exerted by coordinated international action. The rapid shift in momentum reshaped the broader conflict, reducing the ability of Serbian leadership to maintain its hold on contested regions and signaling that the balance of power had fundamentally changed. For many observers, this marked the moment when the dynamics of the war transitioned from entrenched stalemate to a fragile but tangible prospect of resolution. It was a demonstration of how swiftly circumstances could evolve when external resolve aligned with a humanitarian imperative. In the weeks that followed, the groundwork for peace negotiations gained traction. The withdrawal of Serb forces created the space needed for diplomatic channels to reopen with renewed urgency, and international mediators recognized an opportunity to push for a settlement that might have seemed impossible just months earlier. For the people of Sarajevo, the easing of the siege did not erase the hardships endured, yet it offered a glimpse of possibility, a sense that the years of struggle might finally lead to a horizon where normal life could slowly return. Operation Deliberate Force became a defining chapter in the broader narrative of the conflict, a moment when sustained international hesitation gave way to decisive action, altering the momentum and guiding the region toward the first meaningful steps on the road to peace. As the echoes of Operation Deliberate Force faded and Sarajevo began to feel the first breaths of relief in years, attention shifted from the battlefield to the negotiating table, where diplomats raced to capture the fragile momentum that had emerged. The war had exhausted not only the people caught within its borders, but also the broader international community, which now recognized that allowing the conflict to drift any longer risked undoing the hard-won changes that had finally begun, reshaping the region. It was in this climate charged with urgency, wariness, and the faintest hint of possibility that leaders from the warring sides were brought together far from the front lines. To a quiet airbase in Dayton. There, behind closed doors and under relentless pressure, they attempted to piece together an agreement capable of halting a conflict that had already claimed too much. The negotiations were intense from the outset, shaped by competing visions of what a post-war Bosnia should look like and burdened by years of mistrust. Each delegation arrived with memories of what had been lost, with grievances still raw and with political mandates that left little room for compromise. Yet the international mediators understood that the opportunity for resolution was narrow, and they pushed forward by grounding discussions not in idealistic hopes, but in pragmatic realities. The challenge lay in finding a structure that could stop the violence immediately, even if deeper reconciliation would take generations. Every proposal was dissected, revised, and debated late into the night, while outside the conference rooms, the world waited hoping that the choices made in Dayton could reshape the trajectory of an entire region. As the outlines of the agreement emerged, it became clear that peace would come at the cost of a divided structure, one designed to freeze hostilities rather than resolve the underlying fractures. Bosnia would remain a single state on paper, but it would be split into two entities with significant autonomy: the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska. The borders reflected the realities carved by years of conflict, rather than a shared national vision. For many, the arrangement felt like the only workable solution at that moment in time, a framework built not on unity, but on the fragile balance needed to prevent a return to violence. It was a peace shaped by caution, one that sought to contain tensions rather than erase them. When the accords were finally signed, the relief was immediate and profound. The guns that had defined daily life for so long fell silent, giving families their first real chance to imagine a future without the constant fear that had shaped every decision. Cities that had endured sieges began the slow, painful work of reopening streets, restoring utilities, and rebuilding the basic structure of everyday existence. Yet beneath the relief lay a quiet awareness that the peace was tentative, held together by boundaries that reflected division rather than unity. Many hoped that time would transform the arrangement into something stronger, that coexistence might eventually pave the way for deeper healing, but few doubted the challenges ahead. In the years that followed, the Dayton Accords stood as both a milestone and a reminder of the limits of diplomacy under pressure. They ended a war that had devastated communities across Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia, but they also preserved the ethnic lines that had played such a central role in the conflict. The agreement became a foundation upon which the region slowly rebuilt, even as debates continued about how sustainable a peace built on separation could be. For those who lived through the conflict, Dayton marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by the certainty of harmony, but by the fragile hope that even a divided peace was better than the world they had known before. As Bosnia settled into the uneasy framework created at Dayton, the region appeared to be inching towards stability. Yet beneath that surface another conflict was quietly gathering momentum. In Kosovo, where the memories of past grievances had never fully faded, tensions between Serbs and Kosovo Albanians simmered until they began to reshape daily life with a growing sense of inevitability. Villages that once relied on routine rhythms of work and family suddenly found themselves navigating curfews, checkpoints, and escalating confrontations. It was a landscape where trust had worn thin, and where each new incident, no matter how small, was interpreted through the lens of deeper historical wounds. As the world focused on rebuilding Bosnia, Kosovo drifted steadily toward a crisis that would soon demand global attention. By the late 1990s, the atmosphere in Kosovo had shifted from tension to open conflict. Reports emerging from rural areas described increasingly harsh crackdowns, with communities feeling the weight of operations that blurred the lines between security measures and collective punishment. Families huddled inside their homes at night, listening to the distant sound of vehicles approaching, uncertain whether they marked the arrival of routine patrols or something far more ominous. Entire regions grew anxious as stories of violence spread, carried by those who had fled searching for safety. The sense of vulnerability deepened not only among Kosovo Albanians but also among Serb families living in mixed regions, who watched the cycle of action and reaction tightening around them. As the situation deteriorated, international observers struggled to influence events on the ground. Meetings were held, warnings were issued, and diplomatic missions attempted to slow the spiral. But the conflict expanded faster than negotiations could keep pace. The failure of earlier international efforts in Bosnia remained present in the minds of global leaders, shaping their perception of how quickly a local confrontation could transform into something far more devastating. The growing stream of displaced families, the destruction of villages, and the rapidly widening humanitarian crisis became impossible to ignore, and the world once again confronted the question of whether it could remain a spectator in a conflict unfolding at the heart of Europe. When NATO finally launched its air campaign, it did so amid intense debate, driven by the belief that the situation had reached a point where further escalation could no longer be tolerated. The 78-day campaign marked a dramatic intervention, one that carried both strategic intent and deep moral complexity. Across Kosovo, residents found themselves caught between shifting fronts and the uncertainty that accompanies any rapid military change. For some, the strikes represented a potential path toward relief from the pressure they had endured. For others, they introduced a new layer of fear as the conflict expanded into the skies above them. Cities and villages alike felt the reverberations, and the region braced itself for the unpredictable consequences of an operation unlike any seen in the Balkans before. As the campaign progressed, its effects became increasingly visible on the ground. Serbian forces began withdrawing from key positions, opening corridors that had long been sealed and allowing space for international peacekeepers to enter the province. The shift did not erase the hardship experienced during the preceding months, but it signaled an end to the phase of the conflict that had brought Kosovo to the brink. The withdrawal marked a pivotal moment, one that reshaped the political landscape and made way for new administrative structures under international supervision. Yet even as Kosovo stepped into this new chapter, the memories of the conflict remained vivid echoes of a struggle that had unfolded in the shadow of the region's earlier wars. The end of the confrontation in Kosovo did not fully resolve the tensions that had ignited it, but it closed a chapter in the long, turbulent story that had begun with the breakup of Yugoslavia. Each conflict had left its own imprint, weaving a complex tapestry of loss, resilience, and unanswered questions about how peace can be built in a region where history weighs so heavily on the present. As the guns finally fell silent and the borders of the new Balkans took shape, many hoped that the end of open conflict would usher in a long-awaited era of stability. Yet peace, once achieved on paper, proved far more complicated to secure in practice. Across Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, and beyond, communities emerged from the wars carrying grief, distrust, and the heavy memories of everything they had endured. Cities began rebuilding, governments restructured their institutions, and international organizations stepped in to guide the transition towards something resembling normal life. But beneath these efforts, deeper currents shaped the region's future, currents that reminded everyone that the scars of conflict do not disappear simply because agreements are signed. Ethnic divisions, cemented by years of violence and political rhetoric, lingered long after the last ceasefire, In many towns, people still identified neighbors not by shared history but by the lines drawn during the war. Schools, public services, and even political parties often mirrored these divides, creating parallel systems that made cooperation difficult. At the same time, corruption took root in the vacuum left by weakened institutions. Networks of power, forged during the conflict and sustained by economic hardship, shaped decision-making in ways that slowed progress and limited opportunities for ordinary citizens trying to rebuild their lives. Young people found themselves caught between the desire to stay and contribute to their homeland and the growing temptation to seek stability elsewhere. Economic recovery proved uneven and slow, complicating efforts to bridge old divides. Factories that once employed thousands remained shuttered. Infrastructure demanded enormous investment, and entire communities struggled to adapt to new political and economic realities. Many families faced the painful choice of leaving the region in search of work, creating a quiet exodus that changed the demographic landscape of the Balkans just as profoundly as the wars themselves. The lingering uncertainty over Kosovo's status added yet another layer of instability, becoming a symbolic and political flashpoint that influenced regional dynamics for decades. Meanwhile, major world powers, each with their own strategic interests, continued to circle the region, offering support, investments, or political alignment in ways that often deepened tensions. The Balkans became a crossroads where global influence quietly collided, shaping everything from elections to energy projects. For people living there, these pressures served as a reminder that even in peace, the region remained vulnerable to forces far beyond its borders. And yet, despite the challenges, the Balkans also became a place where resilience quietly flourished. New generations grew up without hearing the daily sounds of conflict. Cultural life slowly reignited. Tourism revived cities once defined by wartime headlines, and countless organizations worked tirelessly to promote dialogue and healing. Progress was not linear, and setbacks were inevitable, but each step forward became part of a larger journey toward a more stable and inclusive future. Thank you for staying with this story, one shaped by tragedy, endurance, and the ongoing search for lasting peace. If you found this journey meaningful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring the histories, lessons, and human stories that connect us all.